Hello and welcome to another edition of Let's Talk D&D. So today I am going to talk about Megadungeons and in particular the module known as the world's largest dungeon. As always, I'm just talking about the perspective of 3.5. It's the edition I know and love. So I recently ended a campaign of the world's largest dungeon. So I've been reflecting on that. And I was thinking about talking about some stories from it, and I kept thinking about Megadungeons in general, and I decided that I would focus more on the world's largest dungeon as a campaign, and probably touch on some aspects of a Megadungeon as I see it. One thing that comes to mind immediately, and this is very much a problem in the world's largest dungeon, is you need not only an overall plot, but a constant reminder of plot when you've got a mega dungeon, because otherwise it leads to burnout very quickly, both for players and the dungeon master himself. In the world's largest dungeon, the module itself tells you, like, hey, guess what? We made this really big thing, and it's kind of not supposed to be a campaign. You're kind of supposed to look at it as a bunch of individual parts that you can run within a different campaign. And sure, it'll take you from levels 1 to 20 plus if you were to run it as a whole campaign, and if you want to do that, you can, but we didn't really intend that to happen, so, yeah, good luck. I saw that warning, and I said, yeah, okay, I'll try it anyway. And I did. And I put a whole lot of effort into it, and I changed a lot of things. I read a lot about other people's efforts before I started it, and what they did, and I think it helped me be a little bit more successful. In the end, it was burnout on both my player's part and my part, but that wasn't the main reason why we stopped. The main reason we stopped was more or less just generally no one had strong feelings about continuing. So everybody was willing to keep going. Nobody was really like, no, let's stop. But we all felt like we could be doing something different. And one contributing factor to that is really there's nothing in the way of plot or a drive to just keep them going, keep them exploring. And there's always the possibility of the 15-minute adventuring day once you have a safe location to stop. So building a mega dungeon is very much a difficult thing to do because you need to maintain a sense of danger, but also allow the players to have a chance to rest and do other things other than dungeoneering. And to accomplish that, they need to be able to leave the dungeon. And in some sense, I think a lot of people don't include that when they think of a mega dungeon. Like with the world's largest dungeon, it's just a self-contained campaign, and you're in the dungeon the whole time. And your goal is basically to leave. And there's really only 2 or 3 exits inside, and by inside I mean like published exits. Obviously the DM could always just say, and you find a way out, whatever. But there's really only a couple legitimate ways out, and finding them is obviously not going to be quick, because that would defeat the purpose of the campaign. The 15-minute adventuring day is something that happens pretty quickly then, because the players will explore some, use up lots of resources, and then be like, okay, well, we're stuck in this dungeon, so we need to rest, so we're going back to our safe room. And it can work that way. In my campaign, it tended to be that way. I knew of some areas where it couldn't really be that way due to time constraints, and that's good that there's that difference. You know, sometimes there are different scenarios, and all of a sudden there's pressure on them to complete a task, and that's great, and it keeps that drive going, and it's super rare in the world's largest dungeon. So in developing a mega dungeon, I think that that's one possible way to keep the party moving, is to develop some kind of meaningful pressure, not necessarily one that will end the campaign if there's failure, because that would be too much pressure, but something's at stake, or there could be some really negative consequences, but something that could still be overcome. Perhaps a fight that they could avoid if they succeed at something. Maybe if there were some powerful demon trapped, but it's breaking free, and they need to get something to restore its magical seal, for example, and if they fail, then it breaks free and they have to fight it. That's an idea. Any plot is better than no plot, though. And that's one of the failings of the World's Largest Dungeon, if you consider it as a campaign from 1 to 20. If you don't do that, if you just pick it apart as a group of modules within one book, then a lot of the individual modules are great. They really are perfectly fine if they are placed within a campaign world where they fit, and the quest is set up such that they understand it is this dungeon, just like any other dungeon, and no more, no less. And then you can totally adhere to whatever individual little plot there might be within. However, there are no connections between the regions, so that level 1 to 20 campaign falls apart as far as plot is concerned. So what I did was I developed this story of the Celestial Guardians that had a failsafe to try to restore the prison complex back to its former glory in the event of a catastrophic failure. And in the campaign, that catastrophic failure happens. So then it's up to the players to try to obtain all the artifacts necessary and to procure the needed ritual to restore the dungeon. And, it helped a little bit. It wasn't the most compelling plot for my group. The characters as they developed, and this is one reason why I like starting from level 1, is the characters develop over time. And the way the characters developed, they weren't the most good, I'll say. They weren't the most driven to assist the Celestials in that task. They were more focused on getting out and staying alive. So that plot didn't help my group too much. I think it could have with a different group, but it was partly my fault for not reading my players better, for not getting a better sense of what to do. However, as far as plot you have to work with, there isn't much. So trying to fit something in to this just hodgepodge mess of interwoven regions is pretty difficult. I spent a good amount of time trying to come up with something, and I had a few smaller things that connected maybe 2 or 3 regions together, but nothing overall really except for that. And then I had some Lantern Archons traveling throughout that could kind of let the players know of other goings-on within the dungeon. And that helped to some extent, too. That would put them back on track with directions, where they're going, what they're doing, rather than just wandering aimlessly. And I think that actually is a great segue into another aspect of a mega dungeon, is linearity versus sandbox. If in the World's Largest Dungeon, the setup is basically a square, and you start in a corner, and I'll say that one exit is basically the opposite corner, but the other exits are arguably in one corner and not in one corner. The World's Largest Dungeon, as a full 1 to 20 campaign, definitely takes place in a sandbox campaign world. And by that, I just mean that there's no correct path. There's no railroad. There's really no guide. There's nothing. Players can go anywhere and do anything within that module at any time. So the path that my players took, which was basically north at first, and then backtracked south and then east, probably not the intended path. I'm pretty sure that the expected path is to start out going east, but whatever, that didn't happen. And I didn't guide them. I let them do what they wanted to do. It seemed more fluid that way, a more organic progression. And when they found that there was a barrier in terms of difficulty, they would just change course. And that's fine. I think that with the World's Largest Dungeon, I think that actually worked really well. But I think as a mega dungeon overall, that's not necessarily the correct way to do it. I'm not saying that there is a correct way, just that it could backfire horribly with that exact setup. So I think that is one thing that the World's Largest Dungeon did well, given all of its setup, the ability to go almost anywhere, not literally anywhere, but almost anywhere from any direction, because there are certain areas that are locked magically, etc., in such a way that it strongly discourages the players from going there. Whereas in a Megadungeon, if you were to try to make it more linear, almost, like Hop on the Railroad, like that, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It could work too. It's just that it would need much more plot, that's all. I think it could totally work as a Megadungeon if, say, instead of starting out in region A, and then you can either go to B or E, and then from B, you could either go to F or C, and then from E, you could go to I or F, etc., and it just branches out more and more as you go, because it's a 4x4 grid. So instead of thinking about it, where can we go, if instead, you start out in region A, and then you deal with everything in region A, then you get to B, you deal with everything in B, you get to C, like that. I mean, that could work too if there's a plot driving the party through the Megadungeon. If you've got an overall goal, let's stick with the same story. Let's say you're trying to get out, but instead of having a 4x4 grid, it's a 1x16 grid. And you have to go through the whole thing. Well, how would you handle that? Well, you could just make it so that you don't need to go through everything within each region. So you have certain paths that go through every campaign, but a whole lot of optional paths within. So that way you might explore 1/10 of a certain region, but you explore 80% of the next region. And that could be fine. And I'm not saying that you even have to complete the plots within. Let's say the plot of the first region, there's a were-rat sorcerer, and he's trying to unleash some demons, although he doesn't know what he's doing. He's basically being controlled by an imp. Or was it? I forget. A demon. And, instead of having to fight him, because you really don't need to fight him, let's say that he is near the easiest exit into the next region, so it's likely that the party will confront him, but at least a couple of secret paths, maybe even just a harder to find path, and all of them go into the next region. And let's say the next region is some kind of goblin empire, and within the first region are some random goblin scouts that give us some indication of what's to come. Maybe the players could capture one, or there's a friendly one trying to run away. Maybe he was being hunted down for crimes against the empire, Give an idea of story to come, so that you could be okay, well, we're not interested in where we are anymore, so let's forget about this, let's see if we can find these goblins. Or be okay, so there's goblins somewhere. Maybe we could try to figure out what's going on with this empire. Maybe not. Let's just deal with this were-rat sorcerer first. And there's still choices to be made. There are still areas to uncover within, but it's not like you're going to accidentally find the Celestial Garrison a lot earlier than perhaps was intended, and then learn about these really powerful demons when you're still level 2, and you can't do anything. Even within character, you're oh, that sounds like someone else's problem. You don't want to give the party information too far in advance, because then they're not going to feel like it's their issue. They're not going to feel obligated to do anything about it. They're not going to be motivated. And you don't want them to come back a few, levels later when enough time has passed that something should have changed, and you're not prepared to deal with that change. Because that's a problem with the World's Largest Dungeon proper, is you need to know everything in advance. And because it's such a hodgepodge mess of non-interwoven plots, that it gets a bit messy. So that's where the linearity could come into play in a helpful way, is if you restrict the choices a little bit, you can make it easier on the DM, but also you don't have that overload of choices such that it ends up paralyzing the players. Moving on, cartography is a big thing, so I don't know how anyone would ever go through the World's Largest Dungeon without giving the players a map. It's just absolutely too large to have someone map out. In general, a small dungeon can be fun for the players to map out, keep track of where they are, everything. If you've got 10, 12 rooms or whatever, some hallways going here and there and everywhere, secret rooms, you can map it out, and it can be fun. But when you've got hundreds of rooms per region, 16 regions, and hallways for days that don't go anywhere, and just ridiculous cartography errors, hallways that go from one map to a wall on the other map, it's just too much. Like, you'd have to give the players the maps, and they would just have to accept the fact that, they don't know exactly what everything is, but they're going to make their decisions based on, in character and not metagame it. Like, that's just a thing that should be agreed on, because it just, I don't know how it would work otherwise. I tried to run the campaign in person, originally a couple times with my real life group, and we never got far. Never got far. They tried to map it out by hand, and it was awful. And then we tried it with the maps, and we still didn't get anywhere. But, that time it wasn't because of the maps or anything. Separate story. Anyway, the Roll20 campaign is the one that we actually went through a lot of it, like 2/3 of it, 3/4 of it, probably like 3/4 of it, yeah. It was good with the maps. They had the maps, and it was convenient for them. It was convenient for me as DM. I knew what was coming. I could have everything prepared in advance, and there were no surprises for anybody. It wasn't like, oh, we have to stop for 5 minutes and figure out what's wrong with the map and why your map doesn't look like my map, like what's going on here, nothing like that. So, very convenient. And in any Mega Dungeon, if you're really going to make it big enough, like, or you have another module that is a Mega Dungeon, and it's just big enough to really, really be called a Mega Dungeon, it's just, you've got to have the maps. Everybody should have a map. You don't need to have spoilers on the map. Like, that's not necessary, but, like, you need everybody to have a map. There's just so many rooms, so many places to go, and, you play once a week or whatever, people play less than that once a month, you're not going to remember where you've been and what you've done, and if you got a crummy map, then that's going to make everything less enjoyable. You're not going to want to go back and explore. You're not going to remember, ooh, you remember this thing we got over there? Or that mural on the wall that seemed like it might be clues to something else? You're not going to remember any of that. You're not going to go back and check. And if you do remember, you're going to forget where it was. Like, was it over there, over here, everywhere? Who knows? But when you've got maps with everybody, they can all see it, they can remember, they can take notes. That's great. Taking notes is so great. I love it when people take notes. It helps everything out, not just like with plot-wise or characters that they want to ask, just any kind of notes in general. It shows that the players care enough that they want to think about it. They want to remember stuff. They want to do stuff later. They want to be active. They want to develop their characters. That's great. I love it. So when within a Mega Dungeon, when you're taking notes, that means you care. And if you care in a Mega Dungeon, my goodness, that means you're doing something right. Because I think that most people, when they think that, Mega Dungeons, all they think is dungeon crawl, no plot, just straightforward combat, let's do this, get it over with, get the treasure, get out. And it doesn't have to be like that. It could be more interesting than that. I certainly tried to make the world's largest dungeon more interesting than that. I tried to turn, straightforward combat NPCs into, dialogue NPCs, like what's going on here. Because everybody's trapped in that dungeon. So why would everyone just fight to the death all the time in this dungeon? That doesn't make sense. So I didn't like how much the world's largest dungeon just had straight combat encounters. Like, a lot of them didn't need to be that way. So I changed a lot of it so that it wasn't that way. I had a whole lot of NPCs talk instead of fight. And I think it was a better campaign for that. And again, I did run it as a complete campaign rather than breaking it up into individual modules. And that could be very different if you just take one region into your campaign and run it like that, because then you could think of it as just a small dungeon somewhere. And I say small, you think of it as air quotes, man. Small, wink wink, only 112 rooms. Yeah, okay. So, you fit that or just a small subset of that into the campaign with all the important plot pieces, then sure, they could all be out to get you because you're invading their territory. It makes sense. Or at least in some cases it makes sense. Whereas if you've got this ridiculously large dungeon that's been around for millennia, why would... Okay, if everything was going to fight to the death, then there'd only be, like, a few things left that claimed dominance over their whole area and killed everything else. Like, that's... And then they would die because there's no food. Like, that's what would happen. So, I didn't like that. I tried to change as much as possible to have more dialogue and be more interesting. And I think it needs to be done. As, you know, in a mega dungeon, more so than like a small dungeon, clearly, because I'm focusing on the mega dungeon now. So if you don't have the variety, then you're going to get that burnout I mentioned earlier. And the burnout is killer. I think in mega dungeons, more so than any other campaign, burnout is a problem. So the reason that you get burnout is the same thing will happen over and over and over again. And in a mega dungeon, and especially the world's largest dungeon, you know, you just go through hallways, you open doors, and you fight monsters. So having NPCs to talk to changes things up. And then I also had an interplanar traveler show up randomly to barter with them and occasionally tell them stuff about the dungeon. And I think that that random interjection into the campaign really, really helped just alter the flow of the campaign. Like, all of a sudden, there's something else going on that isn't moving through hallways, opening doors, and fighting enemies. All of a sudden, they have a friendly person to talk to, and then the second time, a friendly person that they've seen before. So, you know, what a concept. This mega dungeon where there's a recurring ally. So, you know, and, you know, air quotes around ally too, but at least it's not an enemy. But you're just, you know, if the DM doesn't burn out from lack of variety on his or her part, then the players are going to burn out because all they're doing is using their combat skills. So if you've got a character like, let's say, you know, a factotum or a bard who's far less active in combat, you know, they're going to get bored a whole lot faster than, say, you know, fighter, warblade, something that can do a lot in combat. Variety is the spice of life, and it is the spice that will prevent burnout as well. Not just the change of pace for the players, but the fact that you can run different encounters as the DM. So the DM will definitely be glad to have other things to do than just roll initiative and fight some combat. Although the players should be creative and come up with, you know, different things to do and everything, the DM has to be extra creative and keep things interesting, you know, keep things moving, giving ideas out, clues, etc. And without anything to go on, I mean, it's a big task in a mega dungeon to just develop new things all the time and an overall plot to keep them going. So having something other than straight combat is a great way to keep the DM active and engaged. Now, I know that the world's largest dungeon doesn't have a good reputation, and I completely understand why. If you want to know more about that, there's a very, very good rant/review. It's by Fatal and Friends, and I would definitely give that a read. Lots of spoilers, but far more in-depth analysis of things than I could do right now. Although every once in a while there are errors in it that shows that perhaps the author didn't quite read through everything, but overall, very accurate. I did read that before I ran the campaign and also during the campaign, just as a refresher, and it helped me see what was coming that I might want to alter. Some things that were brought up were very redundant enemy encounters, so I ended up removing a lot of encounters, and I also ended up changing a lot of encounters. Sometimes there were very large numbers of the same monster type within a region, so rather than fighting, 20 different encounters with Sturges, I made it 1 or 2, and maybe the second one they could just avoid if they didn't feel like fighting it. So that redundant burnout is no longer a thing. And then there's also lots of cartography errors that the review mentions, as I brought up, because that's pretty frustrating. But when you get to the scale of a true mega dungeon, it's hard to not have some things go wrong. And I'm able to forgive, having typos in the text about what room it's referencing and everything, because for the most part, you can figure it out. It's not like it referenced a different region and meant it or something, and you're like, oh, it says it's in E, but I'm reading this in section C, like, what's going on here? It's not like that. It's more like they just got numbers wrong or didn't put a number somewhere, used a number multiple times. And, I get it. That kind of editing error is gonna happen in a huge thing. But the bigger errors are when, hallways don't go anywhere, or they go to the walls, and then there's no entrance into a room, and it's just what is going on here? Blatant errors that make it really obvious that a random map generator was used instead of somebody taking the time to build it. And I get it, This is a ridiculously large dungeon I'm talking about now, the world's largest dungeon. So yeah, random map generator could work. But, I've started building my own world's largest dungeon style campaign before I even knew back in 2004 that that was a thing. Who knows what year I started that? Long time ago. I didn't finish it. It's a huge undertaking. So I get it. The appeal of a random map generator is great. Takes a huge chunk out of your work, lets you just do the creative writing piece of it, and then slap it into there. But the problem is you get something like the editing errors, like a room that is 20 feet by 20 feet, and is supposed to have 4 zombie ogres in it, each being 10 by 10. So what, the room is just jam-packed full of these zombie ogres, and then if you open the door, you just see that the room's packed full of zombie ogres, and then just shut the door because they're so tight in there that they can't do anything. I don't know, it was just silly to me, very silly. So things like that, oh well, editing errors happen. But I guess my point was just that, it doesn't have a good reputation, and I get it, but as a skeleton of a campaign, it's fantastic. You just, as DM, have to put in a lot of work to actually get it to where it needs to be. And I put in a great deal of work. I think that I didn't even put in enough work, and I put in a lot of work. I put in more than I probably should have into that campaign. And I hope that my players enjoyed it. I think that at least some of them did. The problem with it is, of course, just all the things I've mentioned already. So it's just so much work needs to be done that more effort should have been made to say, hey, look, you really can't run this as a level 1 to 20 campaign. Here's a book. It's a big book filled with 16 modules. It's a mega module book rather than a mega campaign. I think instead of calling it a mega dungeon, it should have been a mega module book. And then it probably would have had a better response, because a lot of the different regions have very different flavors that don't really mesh, and there's no overall plot. So on top of all the other smaller things, it's hard to really accept it as a campaign, even as the skeleton of a campaign. Although, if you're willing to put in the work, I do believe it's a good skeleton of a campaign. It's got enough there that you can work with it. You need to go through it. You need to rewrite most of the empty rooms and the encounters. You need to remove a lot, add a lot, change a lot. There's just so much work that needs to be done, and it's tough. It's tough to do that much work. I don't know that it's more work than making your own campaign. It probably is more work than making your own campaign. The only thing there is if you quickly get an idea of an overall plot, I think that it might be less work just because you got to create everything for your own campaign anyway. So not only do you have to create your own plot and all the interwoven strands and everything, but you got to create all of the encounters and all of the maps from nothing. So that's where it comes in as a good skeleton. You've got all the maps worked out. You've got an idea, at least, of all of the encounters and where they are and what they do. It's just that they're not quite right. They don't quite work well. So you need to tweak them all. And there's just so much that needs to be tweaked and taken into consideration that it kind of seems like more work than your own campaign. But it probably isn't. It's probably just a lot of work, period. I've done my own campaigns for years. It wasn't until recently, actually, that I started doing modules. Well, with the exception of the World's Largest Dungeon, because like I said, I had tried to run that multiple times in the past to little success. I owned that since 2005, I think. I have more modules now, but back then it was the only one I had, so I didn't have anything to compare it to. And now I do have a couple other Megadungeons, but I haven't really read through them and I haven't run them, so I can't really make any comparisons to them. So it's really just from my experience running it and reading it and thinking about it and reading other people's experiences with it and reviews of it. And I feel like most people are fairly harsh with it, and I understand why, but I think that more can be salvaged than most people are willing to let on. And, as I'm the outlier there, who knows, maybe you need to take what I'm saying with a grain of salt rather than what everyone else is saying with a grain of salt. So then the question remains, would I recommend the World's Largest Dungeon? And that's a difficult question. I would say I would not recommend it as a DM. I would say that you have to be willing to put in a ton of time and do a lot of work to use it. It can be fun, but I just don't think most people want to deal with that. That's not really why you pick up a module. If you have a good DM, I would recommend it as a player, and in fact, I would love to play through it as a player with a good DM. I think it would be really enjoyable. Even though I'm familiar with it, I think I could still, have a lot of fun out of that. I know that people will run through modules more than once, and I could see myself doing that as a player. I think it'd be a lot of fun. So overall, would I recommend it? Probably not. However, until I do any other Megadungeons to compare it to, I wouldn't be firmly against that recommendation. I would really need other experiences first, and I am a fan of Megadungeons. Like I said, I have others. I just haven't had the opportunity to run them or play in them. Having said all that, I would like to give one story of everyone's favorite character in that campaign, which was Gargog, an underfolk who was a rogue and sword sage multi-class character. And he was kind of a silly character. He always got into the worst predicaments and somehow always survived them. So he became known as like the Cowardly Gargog, etc., etc. All the nicknames. It was lots of fun. And one time there was, I added this to the campaign. It's not in the campaign, but I added this artifact that would teleport the Celestials from one side of the map to another side of the map. And basically what was going on there was kind of like a battle with the Celestial forces and the demonic forces. And the teleporter was one way, it went straight to the battle. So the Celestial forces had labeled it in a cautionary manner, but in Celestial, and the players didn't read Celestial at that point, and Gargog used his use magic device to blindly operate this magical device, and he pretty sure he got a nat 20 on it, so I was like, alright, here we go, and I had already warned them and everything, but I think what really drove him to activate it was the wizard just offhandedly said something along the lines of, yeah, whatever, go ahead, try it. So then Gargog did, and he got teleported into the middle of a demon horde, and I wrote him off as already dead, it's done, and they're like, no, wait, we want to know what happened, what? No. So then I loaded up the map and everything with all the demons, and he was like, ugh. And then I had, combat start and everything, and he was able to, I forget what maneuver it was, a shadow jaunt or, no, it was a short range teleport type of thing. I forget exactly what it was called, just a short range teleport. And he did that to not be in the middle of the group of demons. I gave him, a surprise round since he teleported in, just to be nice. I figured, let him have a fighting chance rather than just go down hard. and they pursued him, what have you, and then he used another maneuver that makes him invisible for a round and was able to get around a corner. So he had a little bit of time. He bought just a little bit of time that he refreshed his maneuvers, and then because he was right next to a lava river, he was able to teleport over the lava river and just run away. And he ran away top speed and managed to pick just the absolute perfect direction and ran right into the celestial garrison on that map, like the forward garrison, and he lived. He lived. So then the next few weeks were spent without Gargog. Basically, the search for Gargog was the current campaign arc for a little while. It was pretty amusing. So, I mean, that was a nice variety moment, a way to dispense with the move through hallways, open doors, fight things. It was more like, oh no, what happened to Gargog? We gotta find him. So it was a fairly enjoyable side quest of sorts within the dungeon, and I think that was a memorable piece of the campaign for everyone, but especially Gargog, because he survived. He was very proud of that. To end, I'll just say that I enjoy Megadungeons. I think that it's probably pretty difficult to pull off a good Megadungeon, but I'm sure that they exist, and hopefully I will have more stories from the world's largest dungeon at some point, because there were a lot, but I don't know if they'll fit in with any other topics I do. But until next time.